In a small village, there lived a young man named Aid. He was an orphan, raised by poor relatives who could barely afford to send him to school. They struggled but managed to see him through secondary school. However, that was where his education ended. There was no money for university. Aid, being a hardworking young man, refused to sit around doing nothing. He decided to take up menial jobs to survive. Every morning, he left home early and returned late at night. Exhausted from the day's labor, he cleared farmlands, cleaned houses, and ran errands for the villagers. But no matter how hard he worked, the money he earned was barely enough to sustain him for a few days. Every evening, he sat outside the small, poorly built room, staring at the sky, deep in thought. Will my life always be like this? He wondered. He saw his mate leaving for the university, while he was stuck sweating under the sun for pennies. The thought of being left behind made his heart heavy. One night, after yet another exhausting day, he lay on his mat, staring at the leaking roof above him. The moonlight shone through the cracks, creating patterns on the floor. He said, "There has to be a way out." Then, an idea struck him. "I will learn mechanic work," he whispered to himself. He had heard that mechanics made good money once. They became professionals. He had seen many of them in the village fixing cars, making money, and living comfortably. If he could master the skill, his life would change. The next morning, he made his way to Baba Tun's mechanic shop. Baba Tund was a well-known mechanic in the village. He was in his mid-40s, with a large belly and a voice that commanded respect. His shop was always busy, with apprentices running around, tools clanking, and customers coming in and out. Aid approached him with determination. "Good morning, sir," he greeted, bowing slightly in respect. Baba Tund looked up from the car engine he was working on. "Yes, who are you?" "My name is Aid. I want to learn mechanic work. I am hardworking, and I promise to do my best." Baba Tund studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, you can start tomorrow." Its heart leaped with joy. He thanked Baba Tund over and over before rushing home to prepare for his new journey. The next morning, he arrived at the shop before anyone else. When Baba Tund saw him, he nodded approvingly. The other apprentices soon arrived, and they all gathered for morning prayers before starting the day's work. Aid was excited, but that excitement didn't last long. The work was tough, much harder than he had imagined. He lifted heavy car parts, crawled under vehicles, and got covered in grease and oil. His arms ached, his back hurt, and by the end of the day, he could barely stand. To make matters worse, there were strange rules at the shop. Apprentices were not allowed to negotiate prices with customers. Any money given to them by impressed customers had to be handed over to Baba Tund. He only provided lunch in the afternoon, and all payment went through him. Aid quickly realized that he was not going to be making any money for himself. His only source of survival had been the little jobs he did for villagers. But now, with 6 days of work at the mechanic shop, he had no time for that. At night, hunger gnawed at his stomach. There were nights he went to bed without eating. On Sundays, the only day he had free, he returned to his old menial jobs just to make enough money to buy food. Meanwhile, his classmates who had gone up to university returned home during breaks, dressed in fine clothes, speaking big grammars, and mocking him. "Look at our dirty mechanic," they laughed. Their words cut deep, but he swallowed the pain. Some nights, he lay on his mat and cried, "Mama, Papa, where are you? Why did you leave me like this?" He sobbed into the darkness. One afternoon at the shop, a sleek car pulled up. The owner was a young man, well-dressed, confident, and clearly wealthy. Baba Tund examined the car and saw that the problem was minor. He turned to Aid. "Fix it." Aid got to work immediately, tightening bolts and adjusting wires. The young man watched him closely. "Young man, what is your name?" he asked. "Aid, sir," he replied, still focused on his work. The young man smiled. "I like your determination. Why did you choose this work instead of going to school?" Aid's face fell. He hesitated, but then poured out his story: the struggles, the hunger, the pain of being left behind. The young man, whose name was Chijiok, listened attentively. When Aid was done, he said, You've been through a lot. As Aid finished fixing the car, Chijioke collected his phone number. I will call you, he said before driving off. That night, Aid barely slept. He kept checking his phone, waiting for Chijioke's call, but it never came. A week passed, then two. Soon, he gave up and forgot about Chijioke. Then one evening, as he returned from work, exhausted and sweaty, his phone rang. A strange number. He hesitated before answering. Hello? Hello, Aid? It's Chijioke. Aid's heart skipped a beat. Good evening, sir, he stammered. Chijioke got straight to the point. Meet me tomorrow. I will send you the location. The next day, Aid dressed in his best clothes and arrived at the location. A white, flashy car pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, and it was Chijioke. Get in, he said. Aid obeyed, his heart pounding. They drove in silence until they reached a quiet street. Chijioke parked and turned to him. I want to help you, he said simply. His eyes widened. Really, sir? Yes. What do you want in life? Aid hesitated before answering. I want to own a mechanic shop like my boss. Chijioke smiled. Good choice. I will help you. He took Aid shopping, bought him new clothes, and handed him a stack of cash. Aid couldn't believe it. Was this real? 2 weeks later, Chijioke called him again. This time, he handed Aid the keys to a fully equipped mechanic shop. It's yours now, Chijioke said. Aid fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. The next morning, he walked into Baba Tun's shop and announced, I won't be working here anymore, sir. I have my own shop now. The entire shop fell silent. Everyone was shocked. How? They whispered. Aid only smiled. He didn't owe anyone any explanation. Excitedly, he opened his shop, waiting for customers. But the first day passed and no one came. The second day, nothing. A week later, barely anyone showed up. Fear gripped him. Something was wrong. He called Chijioke. Chijioke invited him to his house. This time, when Aid arrived, he was led to a strange room. Candles flickered on the floor, and eerie objects hung on the walls. Chijioke's face was serious. My brother, success does not come from hard work alone. There are things you must do. Aid swallowed hard. What things? Chijioke's voice was low and firm. You must join our confraternity. Aid's heartbeat quickened as Chijioke continued, his eyes piercing into Aid's soul. Within 3 days, you must sleep with a mad woman. The air in the room grew heavy. Aid's body turned cold. His hands trembled. Do this, Chijioke said, and you will be rich beyond your wildest dreams. Chijioke said. A long silence filled the room. Then, Aid nodded. That night, he wandered in the darkness, searching. When he found her, he froze. His legs refused to move, and his mind screamed at him. What are you doing? But the fear of failure was stronger. The next day, when he arrived at his shop, 2 customers were already waiting. Before he could finish with them, more arrived. By the end of the week, his shop was overflowing. It's working, he whispered. And every day, he called Chijioke, never stopping to thank him. Not long after, Aid's mechanic shop became the talk of the town. Customers trooped in and out like bees drawn to honey, and money flowed into his hands like never before. Any price he called, people paid without question. His fame spread like wildfire farthest villages. His former apprentice colleagues at Baba Tun's shop were baffled. How did Aid, who struggled alongside us, suddenly rise to such great heights? They whispered among themselves, trying to piece together the mystery. Some said he was just lucky. Others believed he had found a secret formula for success. But no one knew the dark truth. Aid's wealth grew beyond what he had ever imagined. He bought expensive clothes, ate the finest meals, and drove luxurious cars that turned heads wherever he went. The same classmates who once mocked him now envied him whenever they saw him, ashamed of how they had treated him. He helped his poor relatives, giving them money and making sure they lacked nothing. Life was sweet, but it didn't last. One day, he noticed something strange. The number of customers coming to his shop had started to drop. At first, he thought it was just a bad day, but as the days turned into weeks, the decline became worse. He began to panic. Could it be that His success was slipping away. He tried everything, offering discounts, improving his services, but nothing worked. The shop that once overflowed with customers was now almost empty. The fear of returning to his old life gripped him. He couldn't imagine going back to struggling for food, wearing torn clothes, and being mocked again. Desperate, he ran to Chijioke's house, his heart pounding in his chest. "Chijioke, something is wrong," he said, his voice shaky. "Customers are no longer coming like before. My money is running low." Chijioke leaned back in his chair and smiled, as if he had been expecting this. "My brother, you should know by now that wealth does not just stay. It must be fed." Aide swallowed hard. "What do I need to do?" Chijioke's smile widened. This time, the sacrifice must be bigger, a human life. Aide's body stiffened. His mouth felt dry. "A human sacrifice?" Chijioke nodded. He brought out a small container filled with a black, sticky substance. "Apply this to the tires of any customers' car once every month. When the car crashes, at least one person inside must die. That is the price for your wealth to continue." His hands trembled as he took the container. His mind was at war with itself. How could he take a human life? But at the same time, how could he let go of his riches? The thought of returning to a life of poverty terrified him more than anything. He spent the night tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. By morning, he had made his decision. The first customer to arrive that day was a young man, newly married, his face full of life and dreams. "Please check my car. I need to travel tomorrow," the man said with a bright smile. Aide forced himself to smile back. He gave his apprentices instructions, and when they finished, he moved to inspect the car. His hands trembled as he dipped his fingers into the dark substance and rubbed it onto the tires. That night, the news spread like wildfire. The young man had died in a fatal accident. Aide's hands shook as he heard the news, but deep down he knew what it meant. The next morning, customers flooded his shop again. Money flowed like water. And so every month, Aide repeated the ritual. Each time a life was lost, his wealth grew. The more he sacrificed, the richer he became. The fear of losing his wealth drove him to continue, even as the weight of his sins grew heavier on his heart. People never suspected him. They simply saw the deaths as unfortunate accidents. In a nearby village lived a woman named Ifeoma. She was married to Chukwuma, a well-known driver who carried passengers from village to village. Ifeoma was a woman of strong faith, always praying for her husband's safety before he went on his trips. Though they had no child yet, they held on to their belief that God would bless them one day. One evening, as Chukwuma was driving past Aide's shop, his car suddenly broke down. His passengers grumbled and left without paying him. Frustrated, he pushed the car into Aide's shop. Aide saw him and smiled to himself. Perfect, he thought. After the car was repaired, Aide applied the deadly substance to the tires, just as he had done before. The next day was Sunday. Chukwuma and Ifeoma were returning from church, singing hymns in their car, when suddenly the steering wheel locked. The car swerved violently off the road and crashed into the bush. People rushed to the scene, expecting to see dead bodies, but to everyone's shock, Chukwuma and Ifeoma crawled out of the wreckage completely unharmed. Not even a scratch was on them. Shouts of praise filled the air. People called it a miracle. But at that very moment, something strange was happening at Aide's shop. Aide suddenly fell to the ground, writhing in pain. He clutched his chest, gasping for air. His apprentices gathered around him, confused and frightened. He screamed, "Forgive me, my chest is burning." Fear spread among the crowd. "Call Chukwuma," someone shouted. When Chukwuma and Ifeoma arrived, they found a huge crowd gathered around Aide, who was now lying on the ground, drenched in sweat, breathing heavily. Chukwuma stepped forward. "What is happening here?" Aide looked up at him, tears streaming down his face. I did this to you," he stammered. "I have taken away so many lives. I made a deal with darkness, and now it has come for me. Please forgive me." The crowd gasped. Some people cried out in shock. Others cursed him under their breath. A pastor was quickly called to the scene. As prayers were made over Aide, he screamed and rolled on the ground, his body shaking violently. Then suddenly, everything went still. He opened his eyes, breathing hard. The pastor helped him up, but something was different. He limped when he tried to walk. His steps would never be the same again. But he was alive. The next morning, he made his way to Chijioke's house. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why his master had abandoned him in his time of need. But when he arrived at the location, he stopped in shock. There was no house, just an empty land covered with grass and trees, no sign that a house had ever existed there. His heart pounded in his chest. His body turned cold. Was Chijioke even human? Was he a demon or a spirit? Fear gripped him, and he turned back, never to return again. Guilt ate at Ade every single day. He couldn't bear to live in the village anymore. The stares, the whispers, the shame, it was too much. One morning, he packed his bags and left. He moved to a distant village where no one knew him and started afresh. This time, he chose the path of honesty. He opened a new mechanic shop, working with his own hands without any dark shortcuts. He devoted his life to God, spending his days praying and asking for forgiveness. But no matter how much he changed, one thing remained: he could never erase the past. The faces of those he had sacrificed haunted his dreams. The weight of his sins followed him like a shadow. Back in his village, his story became a lesson for the younger generation. The elders would gather the children and say, "Listen, and listen well. There is no shortcut to success. The road may be long, but patience and hard work will always lead to true prosperity." Look at Ade. He had it all, but lost everything because he chose the wrong path. Let his story be a warning to you all. And so, the tale of Ade, the mechanic who sought wealth at all costs, lived on for generations. If you enjoyed this story and watched it to the end, please do not make it your last time on my channel. Like my video, subscribe, drop your thoughts in the comment section, and share my videos with your loved ones. See you all in my next one. Bye.